Now the fun stuff begins. Now we're going to really talk about how ASM does policy building. How does it work? What is its brain doing? And it's actually quite fun. So the first thing we're going to talk about are learning suggestions. We already talked about this. I just showed you a slide, the suggestion list, for traffic learning. So this is kind of a review. Requests come in. As requests come in, depending upon if the policy is configured to do so, we might start getting a suggestion of the file type that was requested. No file type, no ext. We also might get a suggestion for the URL that was requested. Ah, there's a URL suggestion. And as requests continue to come in during this learning period, which could be 2 days, 5 days, 5 weeks, learning period is relative to however long, how much time you need for the policy. Slowly, though, you're going to be building this suggestion list. And it's important to remember that during this time, malicious requests could be sent. And so it's possible that malicious file types are added to the suggestion list. Malicious URLs are added to the suggestion list. That's why they're called suggestions. They're only suggestions. In addition, we might have some pages where users interact with the website using fields, using forms. So this is an HTTP post request. Somebody's trying to log in. And if it's configured to do so, we may also get some suggestions for the parameters. So this assumes we are learning file types, URLs, and parameters. Now the tricky thing about parameters, though, is sometimes you look at them and you're like, I don't know, is that a valid parameter? It's like, sometimes, how do I know? How many of you use Google to search for things? Okay. There's a field in Google that you type your search into. That field has a name. There's a name attached to that field. Anybody have any clue, any idea what that field name actually is? I'll be impressed if anybody knows this. The name of that field, you can go look at it. You can go right click on the field and choose like inspect. The name of that field is Q. So if you were learning the Google website, you would eventually see a suggestion for a parameter called Q. And you might be like, I don't know, is that valid? I'm not sure. How do I know? Well, there's my page. Okay. I see the fields themselves. But I don't know if this is the right names for those fields. Can anyone tell me how I can identify the names of those two form fields? Anyone, nice and loud. Say it again. I can inspect it. We can right click and go to inspect on any of these items on a page. Brings you right to the code, the back-end code, and I can quickly see the name of both of those fields is in fact online ID 1 and passcode 1, matches those. That's my way of knowing, these actually are valid. But that could be the tricky part with parameters. You get a parameter list that some are obvious, but some are not so obvious in terms of the name. The names are created by the web developers. It's whatever was in their head that day when they decided to name each parameter. So that's how we develop suggestions. What happens with those suggestions is a little bit different if we are in manual learning versus automatic learning. So that's what we're going to cover next, is the difference between manual learning and automatic learning. First, with manual learning, here's my suggestion list. And you guys also noticed that the suggestions have this percentage, which is called the learning score. So your file type suggestions have a learning score, your URL suggestions have a learning score, and the parameters have a learning score. All the suggestions have a learning score. The purpose of this learning score, by the way, is to help policy building administrators differentiate between what's probably a valid entry for the security policy and maybe not a valid entry. Typically, items with high learning scores are probably valid, but it's not a guarantee. I'll explain why. So now some time has gone by, and the learning scores continue to go up. And they continue to go up. And you'll notice that the NOAA EXT and ASP, they've both hit 100% now, while the .INI has only hit 13. Because that actually, as a forceful browsing attack, not many people are requesting that. And so the learning score is not going up nearly as fast. So again, as an administrator, I can look at that and say, if I wasn't already sure that that wasn't valid, that might help me to say, I don't think that's a valid file type. But here's the key. In manual policy building, nothing happens until an administrator does something, which is what the students did in exercise 2 of the partner boot camp. An administrator must go in and select those entries and say, yep, I'm going to accept that. I will accept that. Oh, that URL, 100%, that looks good. I'll accept this one here, it's 100%. Oh, the two parameters are at 100%. I'll accept those into the policy as well. Something else they did in the exercise 2 of the boot camp is they accepted requests that hadn't even hit 100%. They know that PDF is valid, so they can go ahead and add that right now. These two URLs, I know those are valid. I can add those as well. So in manual policy building, nothing gets added to the policy without a manual action by an administrator. Something else we talked about in that exercise 2 is these items that we've recognized are probably not what I want in my security policy. And instead of just leaving them here in the suggestion list forever, we can either delete them or ignore them. And over on our side here of the room, that was explained very well. Explained it very well. Delete, when you delete a suggestion, it removes it from the list, but if somebody requests it again in 10 minutes, it'll come back in the list. We'll have to delete it again. If you choose ignore, it removes it from the list and it will never come in the list again. It's ignored permanently, which is probably what you typically want to do. So that is manual policy building. How do you create a policy with manual building? Well, you already did it. That's what they did in exercise 2. They created a security policy that used rapid deployment. They had all these pieces in place. If they wanted to, they could have also selected this advanced option. Wasn't necessary, but they could have. And then down a little further, they could see what the learning mode is. And you can see that by default, with rapid deployment, it's in manual mode. So that's how you build a policy in manual learning. Then we have what is called automatic policy building. A little bit different. The starting point is the same. The starting point is I have my suggestions for file types, URLs, parameters, whatever else we're learning. There's a lot of things we could be learning. These are just 3 examples of things we could be learning. And similarly, as time goes by, similarly we could have malicious entries in this list as well. As time goes by, these scores go up. It's good to monitor, if you're a policy builder, administrator, it's good to monitor this list regularly to see what's going on. And eventually, some of these entries will hit 100%. This is where the difference is between manual and automatic policy building. In automatic policy building, the moment an entry hits 100%, the policy builder automatically adds those to the security policy. They add it to the file type whitelist, the URL whitelist, parameter whitelist, whatever the case is. all the positive security options that we have. It's now considered positive security or acceptable by the security policy. More time goes by, more items hit 100%. So more items are automatically added. And this is just a process now we can go through over a period of time. Here we're already 4 weeks in. Even in automatic mode, an administrator can still manually go in and add things that they know are valid. They don't have to wait for it to hit 100%. The big difference between automatic and manual are these entries. It's important in automatic policy mode for an administrator to address these, either ignoring them or deleting them. And let's talk about why. Let's talk about why this is so important. So the administrator has looked and they've seen, oh, all these things have been added to my policy. These all are great. My policy is getting built really well. It looks good. Nothing bad in there. I'm just going to let it keep running. And they don't do anything with the suggestion list. They just leave it alone. So they haven't ignored those or deleted them. And now time goes by. Now it's been a couple of months. Now it's been 4 months. Now it's been 6 months. Now it's been 8 months. And uh-oh. Eventually, through enough bad requests, enough malicious requests, they finally hit 100%. And ASM added them as valid entries to my security policy. So now .ini is now a valid file type. I didn't want that. So an administrator, even when they're using automatic policy building, they have to monitor that traffic learning page regularly. They have to be reviewing it. And in order to ensure that those things don't happen, is they should be ignoring suggestions that they know are malicious. Because if they ignore it, remember, it goes away from the list and it never comes back in the list. Last week somebody asked, what if they deleted it and it reappeared? What happens to the learning score? It was a great question. If somebody deletes an INI request and it was at 50% learning score, and then later on that day somebody requested again and it reappears in the list, it'll start back at like 5% or whatever the original learning score was. So maybe that would be something you would do if you weren't sure if it was malicious or not. I'm not sure. But if you know it's malicious, they should ignore it and it'll never be added to the security policy. So this lesson contains 2 main topics. That was the first topic, manual versus automatic policy building. How do we do automatic policy building when we create the policy? The main way to do it is to change the template type. There are 2 template types that automatically, I shouldn't say automatically, there are 2 template types that use automatic policy building by default, comprehensive and fundamental. The easiest way I can describe these 3, rapid, fundamental, comprehensive, is they all include default security settings. They all include violations that are automatically set to learn and alarm and block. But fundamental has more enabled by default than rapid deployment. And comprehensive has more enabled than fundamental. So for example, rapid deployment, as you saw in the last class, the 3-day class, rapid deployment does not include file type enforcement. They have to enable file type enforcement manually. However, fundamental does include file type enforcement automatically. So if they choose either one of those, comprehensive or fundamental, as their policy type, and they go down and look, the learning mode, they'll see it's already set to automatic. And you'll notice it's kind of grayed out. At this point, it's not letting them change it. Because there's an interesting little thing here. They could change it, but they have to make one additional fix here. By default, they use automatic policy building. Can't modify the learning mode. We have this thing called the application language, the language the application was written in. It's set to auto-detect by default, which is 100% fine in a production environment. The idea here is once the policy building is running, ASM waits until enough requests come in, and then it can identify the language of the application. And once it recognizes the language of the application, it can move on. What I mean by that is, until it knows the language of the application, it's not going to learn anything else. So in an exercise environment, when you're doing exercises, I always have you change this manually to our application language, because otherwise you'd have to generate a lot of traffic in the lab first, just for this to take place, before anything else can take place. And we just don't have that kind of time to do that. So we're just going to tell it what kind of language it is. But the interesting thing to note is once you set the application language, you could now switch comprehensive or fundamental to manual if you wanted to. It's just an interesting thing. So that's manual versus automatic policy building. The second part of this lesson is to understand the difference between trusted and untrusted requests. Also a very important concept when it comes to policy building. So let's discuss. When a security policy administrator is creating their policy, or after they've created the policy, they can, if they choose to, they can set an IP address or a range of IP addresses that they're deeming as trusted. So in other words, this might be an internal subnet where all of their application developers reside. And at that point, all other requests, anything that's not in this range, is untrusted. Anything in this range is trusted. These would be trusted requests. Everything else would be untrusted requests. So regardless of whether you're using manual or automatic learning, the policy builder can build the policy, it can add suggestions, and it can increase the learning score regardless of whether the requests are coming from trusted sources or coming from untrusted sources. So both of these two sources are involved in policy building. Both of these sources add suggestions. Both of these sources increase learning scores. The key, though, is the rate at which the learning scores increase. That's what's important to understand. So here's an example of my learning score from 0 to 100. And I have a URL called transfer.asp. So this client requests it, that client requests it, we have another client over here that requests it, and you'll notice that we're getting learning suggestion and now score increase for ASP file type and a URL, but they're going up rather slowly from each one of these different sources. I use a phrase over and over again when I'm describing this. The phrase is, policy building takes into account a large number of requests from a large number of users over a period of time from different sessions. That's how scores are increased and so forth. What that means is this guy right here can't just sit there and refresh his page, refresh, and see the learning score for this going up. Well, it doesn't work that way. This guy here can't even close his browser and open it again and see a change. This guy here can't even close his browser and open a private window and see a change. This client here is going to have to wait a period of configured time before another request from them might affect the learning score. So with untrusted requests, we are still going to take them into account. But one source, what we're really looking for here is valid website activity. Now the same thing holds true for these trusted requests. As requests come in, the learning scores are affected, but you'll notice that from trusted requests, the learning scores are going up much faster. That's the big difference, is the learning scores, suggestions and learning scores are taking the effect is, oh, you're a trusted source, so I'm pretty much going to build my policy based on what you just did. One rule still applies though. This one trusted user can't just sit there and refresh and refresh and refresh their page. They still do have to wait a period of time before they can submit another request that'll affect the policy. This period of time, we can configure. We could make this period of time bigger. We could make this period of time smaller. I'll give you an example. In your lab environment, when you're doing the exercise for this, you have to see policy building taking place. You only have one client, the Windows workstation. If we did not affect the learning score speed, if we didn't affect that at all, then the only way that you could sit there and watch your learning scores going up from requests that you're making using a macro in Firefox, this is what you're going to do, is you'd have to wait 30 minutes between each run of your macro. Run the macro, let's go off and take a 30-minute break, and then we'll come back. We don't have time for that. So in a lab environment, we have to drastically change that time frame. But you still have to do two things to make your lab work. You still have to wait a little bit of time. The lowest I have found that I can get that time for us in a lab environment is approximately 9 seconds. That's about the lowest time, which equates to 0.0001 days. That's the lowest setting I can set for that in our lab. We would never recommend that in production, ever. So in your lab environment, when you're generating traffic to see this happen, you have to do two things, and it says it in your guide. So make sure your students always follow the guide, RTFM. You have to wait. You open up a private window in Firefox, you run a macro to generate all those requests. You close the macro. Then you're going to wait 10, 15 seconds. I have them do a couple things in the UI to occupy their time. But then it says open a new private window to run the macro again. If they don't open a new private window, ASM will still see these requests as coming from the same session as before, and it will not consider them new requests.
Well, where do you go this feed? This time?
We'll look at it in a second. It's coming up. So that's really, though, the real key to understand why trusted versus untrusted requests is very different. If I was building a security policy, if I had a customer, or I was a customer, and let's say I had a travel website, pretty big travel website, and I wanted to get a security policy built as quickly as possible, this is what I would do. This is what I would recommend. I have a group of test users in my organization, people I trust, of course. I've identified these as my trust users. I know their IP addresses. So I've added a trusted IP address range, or individually IP addresses, each one of theirs, doesn't matter. And then I put that application out there. It could either be in production or development, it doesn't really matter, as long as they can access it. But it could be in production. Just remember, if it's in production, we may still be in transparent mode. And if it's in production, other users out there are still building the policy, slowly. But I'm going to give all of these guys a little script to follow. And in the script it says, go to the website, browse for airfare options, create a user account, modify your user account, add a credit card, modify your credit card, book travel, change your travel. I'm going to have them do everything you can do in the web application. Because everything they do is going to quickly build the security policy. Every URL they access will be considered a trusted URL, a valid URL. Every parameter they use will be considered a valid parameter, every file type, so forth, and so on. What they have to do, though, is make sure they don't get silly. Like, you might say, hey, somebody showed me how to do SQL injection yesterday. Watch this, it's really kind of fun. Because if he does that, and he sends a SQL injection attempt, ASM's going to look at that and say, oh, came from a trusted source. So this SQL injection signature, we're going to accept this as okay by users for this security policy. So we have to be careful of that. We have to make sure we trust these users. That is what I would do if I was working with a customer to get them to build their security policy as quickly and as efficiently as possible. So, how can I see these learning speeds? Salman's question. It's on our learning and blocking settings page. That should be no surprise. I told you that's where everything is. It's down at the very bottom. There's an advanced section down here. This is where you can see your trusted IP addresses, by the way. So you can expand these sections like loosen policy. So these are the values. I call these the knobs. Now, a question came up last week, and it's a good question, and I've had the question myself many times. To answer this, before I even ask the question, I'm going to ask you guys, how many of you are familiar with our two load balancing methods, predictive and observed? How many of you have heard of those load balancing methods, predictive and observed? Raise your hand. How many of you can explain exactly what those two mean? No, I really can't even explain what they mean. I've tried, and if you can, don't worry about it. I'm just trying to make a point that we have a lot of things in our products that I think I told you the analogy on day one. I know how to drive the car. I don't know what's going on in the engine. I want to teach you all how to drive the car. When people start asking, well, what exactly does this number versus this, we're talking about getting into the engine now. And I have played with these numbers for the last 3 years. I played with them 1,000 times to see how modifications affect the learning scores. They always do, but I haven't been able to, in 3 years, I haven't been able to define a specific way to describe it that says, give it context. So my advice to you is to say this. So again, these are the numbers that are going to determine whether or not an untrusted or a trusted source will generate a suggestion, or if the suggestion is already created, will increase the learning score. The higher these numbers, then the more information needs to come in to do that. The lower those numbers, the less. They're all customizable. So, for example, we have what are called the learning speed options here. There are 3 in this list, fast, medium, and slow. They look like this. So for my untrusted traffic, if you're under fast, it says you only need 10 unique requests from 10 untrusted sources out there in the world, only a half an hour in between them. So remember, you have to wait about a half hour. I told you that 30-minute interval. We have medium. Now it says, nope, I need 20 requests, and there needs to be an hour in between them. And then you've got slow. It says, no, I need 50 requests. So if you're using slow, the learning scores are going to go up a lot slower from untrusted requests. So I have more time. I have more time to generate or to recognize malicious requests and ignore them. But there's actually a fourth option. We've got 3 here, fast, medium, and slow. There's actually a fourth option, which is custom, because you can set those numbers to anything you want. So now I've made this very slow. Very, very, very slow. You could also customize it and make this 5.25, 1, whatever. That's going to make it go faster. You do want to be really careful, though, when you're in production, increasing the learning speed faster than is recommended. One thing to note though, regardless of whether, for example, I'm using fast or slow, the trusted values don't change because I can't go any lower than 1. 1 and 0 is the lowest I can get. So what that means is all it takes is one request from a trusted source to affect the learning score. I can't have less than one request. Another important thing to note is, actually no, let me jump ahead here. So we can define trusted and untrusted information when we're building the security policy. So here's my security policy. I've already done some of the stuff at the top. I've got my application language, I'm in blocking mode. I can also add my trusted IP addresses here. You can either add IP addresses or IP address ranges like I've got. That's not a range, it's a subnet. This only affects the trusted traffic. This only has to do with trusted traffic. This has nothing to do with untrusted traffic at all. And by the way, one other thing, you can also add these after the fact, which you'll do in your exercise. You can remove these after the fact as well. Then right below that, you'll see the Policy Builder learning speed. This is the same setting I just showed you on the learning and blocking settings page. Changes fast, medium, and slow. I want to point this out because my own SE community, when I get guides from them, I'm reading guides from them, it comes to my attention that some of my SEs actually are not quite clear on what I'm about to say. I want you guys to be clear on it. These settings here only affect untrusted requests. Remember, whether I chose fast or slow, it didn't affect the trusted numbers. So I see a lot of SEs that put out an exercise guide, and it'll say, okay, build your security policy and add the IP address of your host client so that your host client will become a trusted source, and change the learning speed to fast. When I see that, I immediately say, that's fine, but that did nothing. That's not going to affect the exercise at all. These two don't work together. Fast is not going to make this any faster. So this is only for requests that are coming from untrusted sources. This is only going to affect requests coming from these trusted sources. That's an important thing to understand. And if you understand that, you understand it better than some of my SEs, which is really good. Any questions first before we go into the exercise? So in your first exercise, you're going to create 2 security policies. The first one is going to be very much like what you did in the 3-day boot camp. You're just going to create a basic security policy using rapid deployment. You're going to add file type enforcement. You're going to learn file types. I think you're also going to learn URLs and parameters, I believe. And then you're going to generate some traffic and view the learning scores. And keep generating more traffic and see what happens to those learning scores. They shouldn't go up because you're untrusted. Then you will add a trusted IP address range, which is the range that your Windows Workstation client is located in, which means your Windows Workstation will now be a trusted source. Then you'll generate more traffic, and you should see quite a change in your learning scores. Then you'll delete that policy. You'll create a second policy using automatic policy building and trusted traffic. And you should see, again, a slight change in how that behavior works. I have about 40 minutes allocated to this. So just as a review for everybody.